Hello Old Testament introduction students. This is a video that I'm going to make for you. As you can tell from the syllabus and from the week off, I kind of delayed the Jeremiah Lamentations assignment it was supposed to be due Saturday, but I didn't even get it out until I think Sunday night. So that's due pretty soon. And then, so Jeremiah Lamentations is an assignment you're working on right now. And then there's I put together Ezekiel and Daniel. I clumped those together and put that at another time later in the week, I believe. And then that means by next week we'll be able to get into all the minor prophets to end the year, basically. That being said, I wanted to make a video for you in which I kind of touch upon these four books: Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. That's a lot of stuff. And the unfortunate thing about doing this class online is, and even an intro class, these books are so, Jeremiah and Ezekiel are so big. And Daniel, especially the second half of Daniel, is so weird. It's really hard to, you can't dive into all the details in an introduction class, let alone an online introduction class. But that being said, as you work through the book, the textbook, that'll give you a lot of the general background information on the modules. I've supplied some files for you where I kind of give my own overview of these books. I don't think I have the one of Daniel up, but we'll get to that. So that'll help you. But there's something about just talking through the big ideas of these books that is helpful. So let's just dive into it right now. First up is Jeremiah. Now again, to understand Jeremiah, you have to be able to understand that Old Testament timeline. I know I sent a file to you a while back, kind of my own handwritten timeline. Study that timeline so you know when each particular prophet did his thing in the history of Israel. You have to know when they prophesied so you can understand the context in which they prophesied. In the case of Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, the life of Jeremiah, pretty much takes you from the reign of King Josiah, which I think he came to the throne in 640, but then started his renovations of the temple and his reformations of the Israelite religion in 627, I think. So Jeremiah begins around that time, but when Josiah dies in 609, that has a downward spiral to the kingdom of Judah pretty quick. After Josiah, his son Jehoiakim comes to the throne. After his other son Jehoiachin gets taken into exile. Well, that's later. Let me back up. Josiah gets killed in 609. Jehoiakim becomes king, and he's a horrible king. And Jeremiah has a lot of confrontations with him. And when you read the book of Jeremiah, you'll see that. When Jehoiakim rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar comes in 597, puts the Jerusalem under siege and during the siege, Jehoiakim dies, and his son Jehoiachin becomes king, and he surrenders to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar therefore doesn't destroy Jerusalem. What he does is he takes Jehoiachin and a number of the aristocratic elites of Jerusalem, basically, back to Babylon with him, and he installs Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's brother, to be the king. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. For the next 10 years, when Zedekiah is king, he's also a weaselly, spineless, horrible king. Jeremiah has a lot of confrontations with him. And so eventually, Zedekiah stupidly rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar comes back 10 years later in 587, and this time he destroys everything. And that's the end of the kingdom of Judah. So to understand the book of Jeremiah, you have to understand that he's prophesying in those last 20 plus years that just saw the complete falling off the cliff decline of the kingdom of Judah. Okay? That's what you need to know. Now, another thing you need to know about Jeremiah is the way it's set up is irritating. You want your books, even Isaiah, it's laid out pretty chronologically. 1 through 39 is clearly in the 8th century between, during the reign of Hezekiah, Ahaz and Hezekiah. Then you get to chapter 40, and it's 160 years later, so you can follow it pretty easily chronologically. Jeremiah's prophecies, though, are not given to us chronologically. They jump all over the place. So you really have to know your history to know when he's prophesying, which makes it harder to understand. In any case, if you look at the file I give you on the module, I kind of give you the historical overview of the prophet Jeremiah, when he prophesied, what the situation was, like I just told you. I do it in a paragraph form and bullet point form. I think bullet points kind of help to understand what goes on. Also, under the structure of Jeremiah, this is what I'm talking about. If you looking at the page 2, the structure of Jeremiah, it's set up according to this structure, but within these chapters, various prophecies from throughout his ministry get thrown in there, not in chronological sequence. But in any case, chapter 1 is the call of Jeremiah to be a prophet. Then the first big chunk of his book is chapters 2 to 25. It's the oracles of Jeremiah, book 1. These are the oracles that, if you know the story of Jeremiah, and by the way, before I forget, I'd like to put a plug in for a kind of an old movie about Jeremiah that shockingly is good, because I'll be honest, I'm a biblical studies guy, and that means I don't like most Bible movies because I find them horribly acted and just not good. But about 20 years ago, there was a movie made about the prophet Jeremiah, starring none other than Patrick Dempsey, the former McDreamy guy from Grey's Anatomy years ago. He's Jeremiah in it, and it's actually pretty good. I mean, they fictionalized some of his personal life, like they put a love interest in there, but watching that video gives you a really good overview of the life of Jeremiah, and just to get a handle on what he was about, it's worth watching. So Patrick Dempsey, Jeremiah, see if you can find it. Enjoy it. Okay, that being said, back to the structure. Chapters 2 to 25, book 1, these are the oracles that Jeremiah and Baruch, his scribe, composed in a scroll that eventually, you have to know you have to know his time period. He's prophesying Jerusalem. He's uttering these prophecies. Baruch is writing them down. And one of the things he's saying is, don't rebel against Babylon. Okay? We need to submit to Babylon. We're a sinful people. This is our yoke. God has put this yoke on us, and we should not rebel against Babylon. Jehoiakim, the king, is getting a lot of pressure to rebel against Babylon. And to have this prophet out there saying, don't do it, makes him mad. And so anyway, some of the royal officials who really like what Jeremiah and Baruch are saying, they convince Jeremiah and Baruch to give them the scroll of their prophecies, and they present it to Jehoiakim. And when Jehoiakim reads these prophecies, he rejects them and he burns them up. Okay? So chapters 2 to 25 is probably that scroll, well, the copy of the scroll that they wrote that got burned by Jehoiakim. Once he burned them, Jeremiah tells Baruch, we're writing them again. And so that's what we get in chapters 2 to 25 probably. Those are a collection of his prophecies. Then chapters 22 to 26 is kind of like a biographical interlude where you have stories about Jeremiah. You find out that his life is threatened during the reign of Jehoiakim. Another one that jumps ahead during the reign of Zedekiah. Sorry, there's something on my teeth. There's a famous scene where I'll tell you right now where Zedekiah, a couple of years later, he's pressured to rebel against Babylon. And there is another prophet, Hananiah, who is encouraging Zedekiah to rebel. And he's saying, thus says the Lord wants you to rebel, and you will break the yoke. You'll free yourself of Babylon. Jeremiah comes into court wearing a yoke of oxen. And he's basically saying, don't you dare rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. God has put this yoke on you. You need to bear it and repent. And Hananiah breaks the yoke from Jeremiah's neck, and he says, no, Jeremiah is a false prophet. I'm telling you the truth. Rebel. And at that point, Jeremiah basically says, you broke my wooden yoke. God's going to put a yoke of iron on these people. And within a couple years, Nebuchadnezzar is going to come back. He's going to kill you all. And Hananiah, you're going to be dead within like 2 years. And that happens. And so therefore, and this is really important to understand about the prophets, especially when we get into them later on, the rest of them. The reason why we have a book of Jeremiah is because what he said, the reason why we have a book of Jeremiah is because what he prophesied came true. He said, if you rebel, God's going to send Nebuchadnezzar back and he's going to destroy everything. Now, at the time when he was prophesying, nobody likes hearing that. Jeremiah was pretty much considered a traitor to his people because he was talking about not rebelling against Babylon. So during his life, he was imprisoned, he was beaten, not well liked. Hananiah, though, he was the guy everybody liked. But when everything transpired like Jeremiah prophesied, when his prophecies were proven to be true and Hananiah's were proven to be false, after the fact, guess what the Jews did? They said, well, I guess Jeremiah really was a true prophet. We're keeping his prophecies. The Hananiah stuff, throw them away. And that is why we have a book of Jeremiah and not a book of Hananiah. Okay? The very reason we have the books of prophets that we do is because after the fact, after they prophesied, the Jews were convinced that they were proven to be true prophets and worthy to keep their stuff. All right. So, anyway, so that's chapter 26 to 29. There's also something in those chapters after 597, the first exile, the first wave of exile, when the elites went off into exile. And by the way, in 597, the people who went off into exile were King Jehoiachin, people like Daniel, Ezekiel, though they went to Babylon in 597. The poor people, like Jeremiah and the rest of them, stayed back in Jerusalem. And so for 10 years, you had this dynamic where some Jews were off already in Babylon. The poor Jews were still in Jerusalem. Having said that, there's also a little bit in chapter 26 to 29 where Jeremiah writes a letter from Jerusalem to the exiles already in Babylon. And basically, he tells them, you're not coming home. Get settled there. You're going to be there a long time. Anyway, so that's 26 to 29. Chapters 30 and 31 is called like the Book of Consolation. It's considered Book 2. These are really important chapters to understand a lot of the New Testament stuff, as well as a little bit later on. But basically, Jeremiah prophesies that they're going to go into exile because of their sin and the rebellion, but God will eventually bring them out of exile, and at some point in the future, he's going to make a new covenant with his people that won't be like the covenant with Moses. All that stuff he says, and then when you do get to the New Testament, the early Christians take up those prophecies and say, this is about Jesus. So there's that connection, Old New Testament connection. Chapters 32 to 45 is another biographical interlude. It tells more biographical stories from Jeremiah's life. They jump back from his time with confronting Jehoiakim to his time confronting Zedekiah, the fall of Jerusalem, the aftermath of Jerusalem. You have to know their timeline or you're going to get lost in all that stuff. After that, you get another chunk of prophecies in 46 to 51 that are prophecies about the nations. Jeremiah was considered a prophet to the nations. So what you see, Book 1 and Book 2 really are focused on, well, Book 1 is focused on the sins of Judah. Book 2, chapters 30 and 31, is focused on the new covenant that's coming in the future. And then once destruction happens with the exile, Book 3, chapters 46 to 41, are Jeremiah's prophecies against the nations. And then 52 is kind of a narrative account of what happened during the fall of Jerusalem in 587. All right. As you can see, Jeremiah, there's like three major themes in Jeremiah. God's policies with the nation. It's not Nebuchadnezzar's doing this. God's allowing Nebuchadnezzar to do this. God's in control of history. Coming judgment is another major theme in Jeremiah, and the new covenant is important as well. So as you clearly can see in Jeremiah, and you'll really see it in the other prophets we do, there's always kind of three parts to Old Testament prophecy. The prophet almost always has an indictment of sin to the people of Judah in this case, an indictment of their sin and a call to their repentance. That's the first part. After that, because you're sinning and not repenting, part two is judgment's coming. You're going to get spanked. And after you get spanked, there's always a third part that looks beyond the judgment, beyond the spanking, beyond the mess that you get yourself into, and there's a promise of restoration. So when you look at the prophets of all Old Testament prophets, you'll see those three dynamics come up time and time again. You're a sinner, better repent. If you don't, bam, you're getting the wooden spoon. But after you get spanked, Daddy's going to sit you on the bed and say, well, I'm doing this because I love you and I want you to be a better person and I'll make you better. That's kind of what prophecy is about. All right. Lamentations, I'm going to just say a couple of quick things about that. You can read the notes. Lamentations is a collection of 5 poems about the destruction of Jerusalem. Traditionally, it's been ascribed to Jeremiah, and maybe he did write it. We don't know for sure. But it kind of fits because Lamentations, these 5 poems in Lamentations, are about the destruction of Jerusalem, and Jeremiah would have been there to witness it. And they are beautiful to read in their tragedy. So I'm not going to tell you much about them. I invite you to read them. But as you can see, there's 5 chapters. Each chapter is a poem. And they're structurally, like in English, you think of poems with a certain meter, like sonnets are iambic pentameter with a certain rhyme scheme. In Hebrew poetry, the way they structure their poetry, and I kind of explain it here, is these are acrostic poems, which each line of poetry begins with a certain letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Now when you read it in English, you can't tell that because you're reading in English. You don't read it in Hebrew. But basically, you can kind of see how these poems are laid out, and you could see that. Poem 1 is a 22 3-line verse with each verse beginning with the Hebrew alphabet. Poem 2 is the same thing. Poem 3 is a 66-line verse where it happens 3, A, B, 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 C, 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 like that. And then poem 4 goes back to like it before. Anyway, that's Lamentations. So Jeremiah, Lamentations. Now we're on to Ezekiel. Ezekiel, now the big 3 prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. They are known as the major prophets. And the easy way to remember them is, for the most part, Isaiah, especially chapters 1 through 39, is set pre-exilic 8th century Ahaz, Jeremiah time. Jeremiah is set right before the exile, those couple decades before the exile. Ezekiel is a prophet in the exile, okay? And Ezekiel is one weird book. It's a fascinating book, but it's really weird if you don't know what you're reading. Okay. Again, I'm not going to read everything for you. I have like a file document for you to read. But basically what you need to know about Ezekiel is he was a priest in the temple of some sort. He went in the first deportation in 597. He went into Babylon then. And so that's in 597. Around 592, I believe, he gets a call to be a prophet. Okay? And then the first chunk of the book of Ezekiel is a collection of his prophecies before the fall of Jerusalem in 587. Okay? That's key. Once Jerusalem falls and is destroyed, the second half of Ezekiel looks forward to the restoration. And you really see this if you take the time to read through Ezekiel. All right? But that's kind of an easy way to think of it. Now, the structure of Ezekiel, is actually pretty straightforward. Like I just said, chapters 1 through 24 is all of his prophecies before the destruction of Jerusalem, 1 through 24. 25 to 32 are a number of prophecies directed at the surrounding nations. Once Jerusalem is destroyed, then Ezekiel turns his attention to the surrounding nations around Jerusalem. When I say surrounding nations, I don't mean Russia or, Afghanistan. I mean Moab, Ammon, the Philistines, the immediate nations around Jerusalem, okay, and Judea. He has some prophecies for them. 33 to 36, Ezekiel portrays himself as a watchman for Israel on the watch for the destruction of Jerusalem. 37 to 39 is a really bizarre apocalyptic vision, if you will. I'll get to that in a second, but it contains basically a prophecy of God will eventually restore the Jews back to their homeland. Okay? But even once they come back to their homeland, evil is still going to be around that God's going to have to deal with. And then finally, in 40 to 48, there is, he looks forward to the time when God fully restores his people. And 40 to 48 is this grand vision of a new temple. It's symbolic. And I'll tell you about that in a second. All right. Now, that's how it's laid out. Now, as far as the detailed stuff, the detailed overview of Ezekiel, just like in Isaiah, just like in Jeremiah, it begins with a call to be a prophet. That's in chapter 1, and really in chapter 1 through 23. He gets a vision of God's throne. The best way I can explain it, because when you read it, it's a really weird description. But if you've seen the movie 300, the Greek movie with Gerard Butler, when Xerxes comes, eventually during the battle, he comes and he has that huge throne chariot that he rides upon. That's kind of what Ezekiel sees when he's describing God's throne room chariot. He's describing something like that. And it has wheels and it goes and there's 4 creatures, the cherubim, the angelic creatures around God's throne. It's a very otherworldly vision. But anyway, God calls him to prophesy. Another interesting thing about Ezekiel, as you'll notice, a number of his prophecies are dated specifically to a certain year, to a specific day, which is kind of an interesting thing. But here, his first vision, which he goes called to be a prophet, is in 592. And basically God calls him to prophesy to a very stubborn and rebellious house of Israel, Judah, basically. And basically, for the next 24 chapters, Ezekiel combines a number of prophecies and a number of prophetic actions, all directed toward Jerusalem's going down. It's dark, and some of the prophetic actions are really weird. He writes a brick. He gets a brick and he writes Jerusalem on it, and he lays siege to it. So these are like little street theater plays that are prophetically saying what God is going to do. He lies on his side for a number of days to symbolize the destruction of Israel in the north and then Judah in the south. He does a lot of weird things. They're meant to be weird. They're meant to be provocative, but they all go to the purpose of prophesying more exile is coming. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. The temple is going to be destroyed. All right? And so that's what that is. In chapters 8 through 11 is important. He gets this vision of the glory of the Lord, the presence of the Lord leaving the temple. Now, obviously, he's over in Babylon, but he gets this vision in which he travels to Jerusalem in this vision, and he looks around the temple area, and he sees all these Jews doing idolatrous things, just horrible things. And therefore, then God calls executioners, and they come and they kill all the idolaters, and then God's glory leaves the temple. And that's really important because the temple was the place where it was believed that God's presence was with his people. So if God leaves the temple, God's not with his people anymore. That's the significance of chapters 8 through 11. Everything in chapters 12 to 24 is, like, again, a combination of various prophecies and prophetic actions. some of his prophecies are pretty vulgar at times, but you can read them for yourself and try to figure out what they are. I'll give you some of the kind of a heads up on what they are. The prophecies of the nation are self-explanatory. Basically, God's going to judge them too. A couple of things now about really 37, 38, and 39. Chapter 37 is the famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. Basically, what Ezekiel sees is a valley of dry bones. And God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? And Ezekiel says, I don't know. You know, you're God. And God tells Ezekiel to prophesy over the dead bones. And as he prophesies over the dead bones, the bones come back to life, and skin and flesh come back on the bones, and there's a huge army of people. Basically, that is a prophecy. The Valley of Dry Bones is a prophecy of God is going to bring his people back from the dead of exile back to the promised land. Metaphorically, it's a resurrection of the nation of Israel. Because once the exile happened, they were no longer a nation. They were dead. Valley of Dry Bones. This prophecy is about God restoring, resurrecting them as a nation, and will be bringing them back to the land. After that, in chapters 38 and 39, though, there is this weird apocalyptic vision of armies on the edge of the known world, Gog and Magog, coming to make war against God's people. They're kind of symbolic of the forces of evil, if you will, and eventually God will destroy them too. So it's kind of a two-stage restoration. In the immediate future, God's going to bring them out of the exile of Babylon, back to the land, but there's yet another exile, the exile of sin and death and evil, so to speak, that God will eventually deal with later on. Chapters 40 and 48, like I said, is the vision of the temple, and he goes into vast descriptions of the temple. And what you see at the end of my file is kind of a picture of what the temple looks like in comparison to what the tabernacle it would be, Solomon's temple would be, Herod's temple in the New Testament. What you see with, and here's the significance, I'll just focus on a couple things. There's a lot of Eden imagery in his description of the temple. The temple he describes in 40 to 48 is huge. It's perfectly square. And it would take up, if you took those measurements literally, it would take up the entire city of Jerusalem. Okay, but that's the point, because the point of this vision of this new temple is not to say that a literal temple that big is going to exist. He's saying that when God brings his people back and eventually deals with evil and destroys evil and sin and death, all of Jerusalem will be holy, because the squareness of the temple resembles the cube-like room of the Holy of Holies. Okay? And so that's what's symbolically being said. When God eventually deals with evil for good, all of God's people, all of Jerusalem will be holy. Everything will be the temple, so to speak. Okay? So that's kind of the importance of it. He also describes, as he's describing the temple, a river of life coming from the Holy of Holies in this new temple out to water all of creation. Well, what does that sound like? Well, if you read Genesis 2, the description of Eden, that's what it sounds like. That's what he's getting at. All right, so that's Ezekiel in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed that. Now, finally, Daniel. I don't have a file for you, so maybe I'll try to put one together. But basically, Daniel is set up in two parts. Chapters 1 through 6 are all the Sunday school stories you might have heard. Okay? You read through them. They all are about what Daniel and his friends go through in Babylon. Now, they have a purpose. I wish we'd have more time to do this. But basically, those stories, when you read them as Daniel's experience symbolizes the experience of the Jews in exile. And the theme of all 6 chapters, all those stories, the first chapter is when he goes and they have the food contest where Daniel and his friends only eat vegetables, they don't eat the king's meat, and they end up being healthier. And so what's the point? Because they stay true to the covenant, even Gentiles start to see that their God is something. Chapter 2 is the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. When Daniel tells the dream and interprets it. What does he reveal to this Gentile pagan ruler? That his God is an interpreter of dreams and revealer of mysteries. Then you have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, because they don't bow down to the idol of Nebuchadnezzar. Even though they're thrown in the fiery furnace, God is with them in the furnace. The furnace represents the exile itself. Okay? And by the time, because God saves them from the furnace, Nebuchadnezzar comes to an understanding that their God is the true God. Chapter 4, there's another dream. Again, when Daniel interprets it, what is it revealed? By the end of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is proclaiming that their God is the true God. Chapter 5 is Daniel in the lion's den. Because Daniel stays true to his God, even though Darius throws him in the lion's den, he's saved from the lions. Again, that's kind of symbolic of the exile itself. Okay? And then finally, the last one is the writing on the wall, where Daniel interprets the writing of the wall years later with, it says Nebuchadnezzar's son, but it really was his grandson. Oh, I messed that up. Chapter 5 was that. Chapter 6 is the Daniel in the lion's den. I messed those up. All those stories in chapters 1 through 6 really go to the heart of saying that Jews who are faithful to God, even in exile, God will be faithful to them. And there's more to it, but that's kind of what 1 through 6 is about. The weird stuff happens in chapters 7 through 12, and it's apocalyptic literature, imagery stuff. Really hard to explain in a short video, which is getting longer. But I'll just focus on chapter 7, because that's really important, not just for Daniel, but also because it has a lot of New Testament implications. In chapter 7, Daniel gets a vision, and he sees a violent sea, and beasts come up out of the sea, 4 of them. Okay? What does this mean? Symbolically speaking, the sea represents the sea of chaos, evil. These beasts that come out of the sea are various empires that correspond to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, by the way. There's Babylon exile, the Babylonian Empire, the Medes, the Persians, and then a 4th beast, which be the Greeks. And this 4th beast comes out. He's worse than all of them. And then there's this really weird vision of there's horns on this beast's head, and then a little horn comes up, and he's a really boastful horn, and he's talking blasphemies and smack about God, and this little horn is at war with the saints, God's people. Okay? Now, obviously this is symbolic. We're not talking about a little horn, fighting people. This little horn, and there's a huge interpretation controversy going on here. I think you have to understand what's going on here in light of the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century. Okay, this is the story of Antiochus Epiphanes. This is a long story. Antiochus Epiphanes was a Seleucid ruler, a Greek ruler, who tried to wipe out the Jews and force them to worship him. And this sparked the Maccabean revolt, and eventually the Maccabees pushed him out of the area, and that's Hanukkah celebrates that victory. But at the time, Antiochus Epiphanes was kind of seen as like the Hitler of his time. He literally tried to exterminate the Jews. And a lot of scholars think that this vision in chapter 7 leads up to that event. The little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's trying to wipe out the Jews. And Daniel's vision is when he sees the little horn fighting against the saints, he then sees one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, it's important to realize that the one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, he's not seeing somebody come down. He's seeing the Son of Man ascend, coming on the clouds of heaven, to be at the right hand of the Almighty. And when he is enthroned with authority of God himself, the Son of Man will destroy the beasts and the little horn and redeem his people. Okay? That's the hope. Now, obviously, the Son of Man is a messianic figure, and the Jews in the intertestamental time, after they come back from the exile, they're back in the land, but they're still not, the full restoration hasn't happened yet. So a lot of the Jews looked at this prophecy as if, in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, as if to say, Antiochus Epiphanes will be destroyed, but we're still looking for that Messiah to fully redeem us. Okay? And so that's what that chapter is about. What you get in the New Testament is obviously the Christians seize upon this chapter, and they basically say the Son of Man is Jesus, and he is the one who is freeing not just ethnic Jews from Gentiles, but he's freeing the true faithful children of God from the forces of evil. There's more to it than that, but in a nutshell, that's kind of what you see in chapter 7. The rest of Daniel is a number of other apocalyptic visions that the book will probably tell you a little bit about. They all have to do with Persia and Greece and things, basically, quite frankly, that are very applicable to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean revolt. All right. So, hopefully, this video is about 30, 40 minutes. That's an overview of these books. The textbook will give you a good, some overview as well. But if you know those outlines and how the books are put together, if you take the time to read through them, there's so much going on there. It's fascinating. All right. Thank you.